My name's Stephanie. I'm one of Ellie's big sisters, and I wasn't able to make it to Ellie's birthday party this weekend because I live in Kansas City, which is kind of far away from Minnesota. But my mom tells me that Ellie is having an Esther birthday party, which I think is amazing because Esther is my favorite biblical character. So my mom asked me if I would tell you guys the story of Esther. So everybody take a seat and be really quiet because this is a super exciting story and you don't want to miss any of it. Are you guys ready? Okay, here we go. Once upon a time, there was a beautiful young woman named Esther. She lived in a country called Susa. It's really far away from us, but it's way overseas and it's in the desert, hot and dry and lots of sand. So Esther was an orphan. Esther's parents died when she was really little, but her cousin Mordecai decided to take her in and raise her as his very own daughter. Well, one day, the king of Susa, whose name was Xerxes, decided he was really lonely and he wanted a wife. So he came up with the plan to hold a royal pageant. He told his advisors to go and grab all of the beautiful girls of the country and have them get ready. So the day came for Esther to be taken, and her cousin Mordecai, who was really wise and who listened to God and prayed a lot, he pulled her aside and he told her, he said, "Esther, you've got to keep a big secret, okay?" Esther said, "Of course, cousin Mordecai. What's the secret?" And her cousin Mordecai told her, "You can't tell anyone that you're a Jew." Now, being a Jew wasn't a bad thing, and it isn't a bad thing, but in the day that Esther lived in and in her country of Susa, there was a lot of people who didn't like the Jews very much. So Mordecai was very wise in telling Esther not to tell anybody that she was a Jew. So Esther was taken from her home and went to live in the palace, and then you'll never guess what happened. So for one whole year, all she did was enjoy a giant spa day. All of the girls got royal beauty treatments. They got their fingernails painted, they got their makeup done and their hair done. They even got to have bubble baths every single day for a year. It was crazy. So at the end of the year, right before the girls would go on their big date with the king, they could go into the king's royal treasury and pick out any jewels that they wanted. And they got to keep them too. I mean, we're talking gold and diamonds and rubies and pearls, anything you wanted. But Esther didn't take anything with her on her date to the king because she knew it wasn't just about outward beauty, it was actually really about your heart. And she wanted the king to fall in love with who she was on the inside, not just on the outside. So Esther's date day came, and she met the king. They went on a wonderful date, and they talked and they laughed, and the king fell in love with Esther. He loved her more than any of the other young women that he'd gone on a date with. And that very night, he took the royal crown and he put it on her head. And he made her queen of the whole entire country. Isn't that crazy? Esther was an orphan. She was just a normal girl like you or me. And now suddenly, she was the queen of the biggest kingdom of her day. That's pretty crazy. Now, most stories end here with a happily ever after and the end. But Esther's story doesn't. Her story actually gets even more exciting after she becomes queen. So you remember what I told you about her cousin Mordecai? Well, Mordecai worked in the palace. He helped out the king. And one day when he was working in the palace, he overheard these two really wicked servants. And they were talking to each other and they were planning how they were going to kill the king. Isn't that crazy? They were going to poison him. So Mordecai ran straight to Esther and he told her everything, told her all about their plan to poison the king. And so Esther went to the king and told her what Mordecai had found out about these servants. And the servants were busted. They didn't poison the king and they got thrown in jail instead. And all was happy. So all of these things, all these events with Mordecai and saving the king's life, They were all written down in these giant books that were called the Chronicles. But Mordecai was never rewarded for the deed that he did for the king. Now this comes into play later, so don't forget that point, and let's keep going. Now, this is where we meet the villain. His name is Haman. He was a really bad man, but the king didn't know that. The king actually made him almost his best friend. He made him a prince. It was crazy. So Haman was very prideful. He thought really highly of himself and thought he was way better and way nicer guy than he actually was. And every time that he would go through the streets, everybody was supposed to bow to him because he was a prince. Well, one day, when he was riding through the streets, he passed by Esther's cousin Mordecai, and Mordecai wouldn't bow. This made Haman really angry. So Haman came up with a really evil plan. Not only did he want to kill Mordecai, he wanted to kill all of the Jews. Isn't that crazy? So, because Haman was one of the king's best friends, he knew he could go straight to the king. And if he was really sneaky about the way that he said it, the king just might go along with his plan. So Haman went up to the king one day and, made him feel good about himself, and he said, "Hey, friend, I have a plan. You see, there's these certain people in your kingdom, and they're not like other people. They don't do the same things other people do. They have other laws than we do. They're a bad people. You don't want them in your kingdom. We should get rid of them." And because Haman never specified the Jews, and the king had no idea that Esther was a Jew, the king went along with Haman's plan. He even gave him his signet ring. That was a really big deal. If you had the king's signet ring, you could do anything you wanted to. So Haman went off, and he made a royal decree. And he sent off the decree to all the land of Susa. The decree said that on a certain day of the month, all of the people who had Jews as neighbors could kill them. They could not only kill the men, but they could kill the women and their children too, and take anything they wanted from their houses. Haman was a really, really bad man. So, after the decree went out and all the Jews found out, Mordecai was crying, and he was on the floor, and he was really upset. He even tore his clothes, and he put dirt on his head, and he was crying. And one of Esther's servants happened to walk by Mordecai and asked him, "Mordecai, what's happened?" And so Mordecai told him everything. And so he ran straight away, and the servant told Esther all that had happened for her people. So she sent the servant back to Mordecai with the message of, "Mordecai, what shall I do?" And Mordecai said to her, "You must go before the king. For who knows, Esther, that you weren't made the queen for such a time as this?" So Esther decided that she would fast for 3 whole days, which means she didn't eat anything. And to make it even more extreme, she didn't even drink anything. So for 3 whole days, Esther and all the Jews of the land entered into a fast, and they prayed and they cried out to God and asked him to save their people. Because Esther knew that if she went before the king without being summoned, she could die. Back in that day, the law was if you showed up in the king's palace without him wanting you there, he killed you. So Esther knew that what she was planning on doing would probably lead to her death. She was really brave. So at the end of 3 days, Esther went to the court of the king. She hadn't been invited. She hadn't even been invited in a couple of months. It was really scary. So there she was, standing in front of the doors. Would you be scared if you knew that what you were about to do could actually end up getting you killed? But she did it anyway, because she knew that God gave her the position of queen for a reason. So she walked into the doors, and when the king saw her, he extended his royal scepter to her, which meant that he granted her her life. So Esther didn't die. He was so happy to see her because he was so in love with her that he actually asked her, "Queen Esther, what is it that you want? Or do you desire something of me? Even up to half of my kingdom, I'll give it to you." So Esther, being very wise and seeing Haman sitting right next to the king, knew that it wasn't the moment to tell him what she really wanted. So she said, "Come to a banquet that I will prepare for you this evening. And bring your friend Haman too." So she went home and she prepared a beautiful banquet for them. And the king came and he brought Haman. And they talked and they laughed and they ate food, and it was a good evening. And at the end of the evening, the king looked at her again. He said, "Queen Esther, I know there's something you want. What is it? You can tell me. Even up to half of my kingdom, I'll give it to you." Esther still knew that it wasn't the right moment. So she said, "My dear king, if it pleases you, would you come one more evening? Come again tomorrow night to my quarters. I'll prepare another great feast for you. Bring Haman also, and tomorrow night I'll tell you what's really on my heart." So that night, Haman went home, and he was all puffed up with pride, thinking he was the queen's favorite. He'd been the only one invited to the banquet. So he went home, and as he went home, he passed cousin Mordecai, who wouldn't bow to him. So that made him really angry. So he went home and he talked to his wife and his kids, and he said, that bad man Mordecai, he won't bow to me. What should I do?" So they counseled him another evil scheme to have Mordecai killed the very next day. But you'll never guess what. So that same night, while Haman was plotting against Mordecai, the Lord was working to save his life. Now, the king couldn't sleep that night because he was just restless. So he pulled out those big books. Remember what I told you about the Chronicles, that they write down all these really boring details? So they pulled him out to read to the king so that hopefully he'd get bored and fall asleep. But he didn't. They were reading and reading, and suddenly they came on the part about how Mordecai had uncovered the plot of the wicked servants and saved the king's life. The king said, "Was anything done for that man?" "No," they said. So the king thought it over, couldn't really decide what to do, and you'll never guess who burst into his bedroom early in the morning. Haman. So Haman came with his wicked plan to kill Mordecai, while the king was wondering how he could honor him. So before Haman could start on his wicked plan, the king asked Haman, "What would I do for a man that I delight to honor?" Haman looked around. "Must be me," he thought. Who better than me for the king to honor? He loves me the best. Queen Esther loves me the best. The king's definitely talking about me. So, because Haman thought the king was talking about him, Haman told the king, "Have a royal horse, the royal horse, be brought around, the very horse that the king himself rides, and let a royal robe of the king's very own be draped over his shoulders, and send a man out before him proclaiming, 'Thus shall be done for the man the king delights to honor.'" Now you can bet how pleased Haman was with himself, thinking this was going to be the best day of his life. So the king said, "Yeah, I like that idea. That's a great idea. Haman, you go and do all of that for Mordecai, the Jew." Can you imagine? So Haman had to take his worst enemy, Mordecai, through the streets saying that this Mordecai was the man that the king delighted to honor. It was pretty mortifying for Haman, if you ask me. So Haman shows up to Queen Esther's that night. It was really out of sorts. It'd been a bad day. But Queen Esther and the king, they talked and they connected and they had a great evening. So at the end of the night, the king asked her one more time, "Queen Esther, I know there's something on your heart. What is it that you want from me? Even up to half of my kingdom, I'll give it to you." So Queen Esther summoned all of her courage, and she said, "King, I'm asking you for my life. If I had been sold to be a servant, I would have kept my tongue. If I had been sold as a slave to another country, I would have kept my peace. But I'm asking you for my life and the lives of my people, because we have been sold to be killed." And the king was totally surprised. He didn't know anything about it. And, "What, Queen Esther? Who is trying to kill you?" And Esther said, "It's that man, that wicked Haman. He's trying to kill all of the Jews." So, of course, Haman was completely surprised because nobody knew Queen Esther was a Jew. And the king was so angry that anybody would try to kill the love of his life. And he was so mad that he stormed out of the room. Well, Haman, being scared and knowing that he was in big trouble, got up and he was pleading with the queen. "Oh, Queen Esther, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. And just before the king walked back in the door, Haman tripped and he fell over the couch where Queen Esther was sitting, and the king came back in right then. And he got even angrier and he said, "How dare you try to assault my wife while I am in the kingdom?" And he was so mad that he ordered Haman killed that very night. So, safe to say that the best day of Haman's life, or what he thought was going to be the best day, turned out to be the worst. And even better, the king gave Mordecai all of Haman's possessions, his house, his land, his money, and even his position. The king made Mordecai a prince. Now, they couldn't just get rid of the proclamation that the evil Haman had made, but they could write a new one. So, the king gave Mordecai his signet ring and told him to write whatever he needed to make sure that all of the Jews were safe. So Mordecai sent out a new proclamation to all of the lands of Susa that said on that day that all of the Jews were supposed to be killed. Instead of being killed, they could fight back, and they did. So none of the Jews ended up dying that day, and the Lord used Esther in a really amazing way to save the lives of all of her people. So, now I can safely say that Queen Esther, Mordecai, and the king all lived happily ever after. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed the story of Queen Esther as much as I do. She's a really exciting woman, and I'm always so inspired about her obedience to God and to even her cousin, because her cousin told her not to tell that she was a Jew, and she didn't. It's pretty amazing what God can do if you trust him. Well, I hope you guys have a great day. Ellie, happy birthday. I love you. Mwah.